Learning from Las Vegas by Robert Venturi, Denise Scott Brown, and Stephen Eisenhower. The research for Learning from Las Vegas was started as a collaboration between Venturi Scott Brown Associates and Yale School of Art and Architecture. Venturi Scott Brown Associates was a firm started by the couple Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown. Stephen Eisenhower was a principal at the firm. These three were the authors for Learning from Las Vegas, first published in 1972, and were also the instructors during the Yale Studio project titled Learning from Las Vegas, conducted in 1968. The authors chose Las Vegas as a basis for the studio study. Las Vegas is a city that breaks the modernist movement of heroic industrially influenced design and relies on communication as its architecture. Learning from Las Vegas was a triumph from the outset and questioned the modernist movement and trying to contextualize everyday life. Denise Scott Brown was quoted saying, "You fight an old revolution with a new ordinariness. We are not interested in learning from a corporate architecture. We learn from a more playful approach. It's like Beethoven learning from a folk song for a string quartet." Learning from Las Vegas was praised for its forward-thinking arguments about the ordinary and criticized for being an attack on modernism. In 1973, review by Gary Wolfe for the Journal of Society of Architectural Historians stated that Learning from Las Vegas is symptomatic of the broadening of the foundations of architecture and of the application of this understanding of cultural complexity to architecture and planning. The review goes on to talk about how the book can be seen as a historical marker for a turning point in architecture. I see this as a junction between heroic and contextual, corporate and social, and modernism and postmodernism. The book was revised in 1977 edition. This provided a more concise and readable book, helping in the understanding of the theoretical position taken by Venturi Scott Brown Associates. The book is now in two parts. Part 1, Learning from Las Vegas, a description of the findings and mapping of the Las Vegas Strip conducted during the Yale Studio in 1968. And Part 2, Ugly and Ordinary Architecture, or the Decorated Shed, theories and symbolism based on the research gathered in Part 1. Part 1, Learning from Las Vegas. Part 1 looks to understand the Las Vegas Strip using classical architectural mapping techniques and evolve these into a method of understanding the commercial vernacular, or the everyday. The authors argue that at this point in time, pop art was looking at the language of the commercial for influence, but architecture wasn't. By following pop art, we can start to understand how the everyday has become architectural. This is a way of learning from the everyday. This statement is a criticism on modernist architecture at the time. It infers that architects would look at what they wanted to and ignore the everyday. This ignorance created purist monuments to modernism and not publicly accessible design. Modernist architectural influences. Le Corbusier gained influence from grain elevators and steamships, Bauhaus gained influence from the factory, and Mies gained influence from the American steel production. Modernism uses these influences as the content of design, whereas Learning from Las Vegas sets out that influence should be a method to design and not the designed content. This sets up Part 1 as a discussion of how there is symbolism in everything and what we can learn from this. This is a method, not content. This understanding of contextual symbolism is shown in pop art of the time. Andy Warhol's 8 Elvises shows how the influence of the fast-paced culture of the 60s and 70s is encapsulated and reimagined in art. The repetition of fame, fear of death, and icon shows the fleeting and fast-paced world of celebrity. The more repetition, the more mundane celebrity becomes. This example helps us understand how the same method could be used to explain Robert Venturi's "less is bore" reimagining of the famous Mies quote, "less is more." If we apply the idea that we can learn from everything, then architecture of the billboard must be accepted as representational architecture. The billboard, like the Warhol screen print, represents the fast-moving pace of automobile-driven life in America in the 1970s. This understanding led to the Yale Studio study of Las Vegas, mapping Route 66 Strip using symbolism and advertising as the predominant architectural language. This developed into the quote that defined this architecture: "The big sign and the little building is the role of Route 66. These findings lead into the Part 2 as they explore the theory of the decorated shed. Part 2. Ugly and Ordinary Architecture, or the Decorated Shed. This section describes an analogy for all buildings to be understood as either a duck or a decorated shed. A duck is a building that symbolises its purpose through the use of form. A decorated shed uses decoration and ulterior symbols to show the function, whilst architecturally being a space-oriented design. The author goes on to use this analogy as a comparison of modern architecture versus ugly and ordinary architecture of Venturi Scott Brown Associates. This is described through the comparison of The Guild House by Venturi Scott Brown Associates and Crawford Manor by Paul Rudolph. This comparison concluded that modernist architecture, whilst trying very hard to remove itself from decoration and symbolism, became a symbol of modernism, a duck in the form of modernist architecture. In substituting articulation for decoration, it has become a duck. Learning from Las Vegas shows how this analogy can also be used to describe a cathedral as both decorated shed and duck. The front of the cathedral is decoration with little or no relationship to the function behind, hence a decorated shed. The nave and main space of the cathedral is in the shape of a cross denoting the religious function of the building, hence a duck. This analogy is what Venturi is famous for. He is not the father of postmodernism, but the father of thinking about the everyday. This thinking went on to change architecture of the time and started the movement from modernism to postmodernism. Uniform glass boxes gave way to pop whimsy rendered in plaster. Form-based meaning was supplanted by sign and symbol-based meaning. The ideas of billboard architecture can still be seen today. FAT's New Islington Square social housing in Manchester is an example of how the decorated shed analogy can still be seen. To conclude, the book was written as a turning point in architecture and became a historical landmark in the move from modernism to postmodernism. Part 1 sets out how we can use architectural analysis not just for physical form influence, but to understand how everything and every day works best in a space. This then allows us to design with the everyday in mind. Robert Venturi said, "We are not trying to be avant-garde. In this era, to be unheroic is to be heroic. To be unconventional is to be conventional. It's harder to be good than to be original." Part 1 defines what is required to create postmodern architecture, though Robert Venturi would never say this. The idea of everything and every day becoming notable started the idea of anti-aesthetic or postmodernism. When asked by a reporter if he was a postmodernist, Robert Venturi said, "Freud was not Freudian, Marx was not a Marxist, and Bob is not a postmodernist." Part 2 takes the everyday and helps categorize buildings and signs through the duck and shed analogy. The creation of this analogy defined how architects thought of themselves and gave a clear, if not simple, basis for an architect's personal manifesto. I believe that the ongoing attack on modernism was not meant with any malice. Learning from Las Vegas does not discredit the founders of modernism. It speaks to those designing in its shadow and urges architects to embrace the technological advances of life and not be stuck in the past for purist aesthetic reasons. It would be interesting to look at architecture today through the eyes of this book. One could say that sustainable architecture is going the same way as modernism in the 1970s. Is sustainable architecture becoming a duck of sustainable signifiers? Or are sustainable technologies decoration to the insulated shed? Duck or shed?